One queen was accused of using sorcery to try and kill her rival's husband, the king. A royal affair led to 3 princesses being imprisoned, with one allegedly murdered in her cell. A 60-year feud between 2 Frankish queens saw husbands, sons, and grandsons slaughtered. One famous queen spent 16 years imprisoned by her own husband, partly fueled by his very public affairs, and 2 women with the same first name fought a brutal civil war for the English crown, tearing the country apart. Get ready for some serious medieval drama. Number 5. Matilda, B.S. Matilda. The crown couldn't handle 2 queens, named Matilda. Picture this. England in the 12th century. King Henry I, a powerful ruler, has a bit of a problem. His only legitimate son drowned. Oops. So, who gets the crown? Henry makes all his important nobles swear an oath. They promise to support his daughter, Empress Matilda, as the next ruler. This was a big deal. A woman ruling England in her own right. Pretty much unheard of. Empress Matilda was no shrinking violet. She'd been married to the Holy Roman Emperor, hence the Empress title, so she knew a thing or two about power. After her emperor husband died, she married Geoffrey of Anjou. She was strong-willed, maybe a little too proud for some people's taste. Enter the other Matilda, Matilda of Boulogne. She was married to Stephen of Blois. Stephen was King Henry I's nephew, and he was popular. Like really popular. While Empress Matilda was often abroad, Stephen was right there in England, charming the nobles. Matilda of Boulogne was also a force to be reckoned with. She was Countess of Boulogne in her own right, a smart and capable woman, and fiercely loyal to her husband. So, King Henry I dies in 1135. What happens next? Stephen, with his wife Matilda of Boulogne right by his side, makes a dash for England. He gets himself crowned king before Empress Matilda can even pack her bags. The nobles who swore that oath to Empress Matilda, well, many of them conveniently forgot about it. They preferred a man on the throne, and Stephen seemed like a good bet. Empress Matilda was not amused. Not one bit. She said, "Hold up, that's my crown." And so began a period in English history known as the Anarchy. Sounds fun. Right, it wasn't. It was years of civil war. Empress Matilda, with support from her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, finally invaded England in 1139. Matilda of Boulogne, meanwhile, wasn't just sitting around knitting. She was a skilled military strategist and rallied support for her husband, King Stephen. She even led troops herself. Talk about a power couple. The war lurched back and forth. In 1141, things got really spicy. At the Battle of Lincoln, Empress Matilda's forces captured King Stephen. Yes, the king himself was prisoner. Empress Matilda marched towards London, ready to be crowned queen. She started calling herself Lady of the English. But then, she kind of messed it up. She was apparently quite arrogant and upset the Londoners, who chased her out of the city. So close. Now, with King Stephen in chains, who steps up? Queen Matilda of Boulogne. Of course she didn't despair. She gathered an army, rallied Stephen's supporters, and fought back hard. Later that same year, her forces scored a huge victory at the Rout of Winchester. And guess who they captured? Robert of Gloucester, Empress Matilda's best general and half-brother. So now it's a prisoner exchange. King Stephen was swapped for Robert of Gloucester. The war dragged on. Empress Matilda found herself besieged in Oxford Castle in the dead of winter. Things looked grim. But she made a legendary escape, sneaking out of the castle at night, dressed in white to blend in with the snow, and walking miles through frozen enemy territory to safety. You can't say she wasn't determined. Through all this, Matilda of Boulogne was a constant source of strength for Stephen's side. She managed their lands in Boulogne, raised money, and negotiated with allies. She was an active partner in his reign, not just a supportive wife. The anarchy caused massive suffering in England. Fields weren't planted, villages were burned, and law and order broke down. 19 long winters, one chronicler wrote, when Christ and his saints slept. What happened to our two Matildas? Queen Matilda of Boulogne, Stephen's wife, died in 1152. Her death was a huge blow to Stephen, both personally and politically. She had been his rock. Empress Matilda eventually left England, her hopes of being crowned queen dashed. But she didn't give up on her family's claim. The war eventually fizzled out. In 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford was agreed. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life. But, and this is a big but, Empress Matilda's son, Henry, would be his heir. So, in the end, Empress Matilda's line did inherit the throne. Her son became King Henry II, one of England's most famous kings. Empress Matilda lived to see her son become king. She died in 1167, having been a queen in waiting, a military leader, and a mother of a king. Both Matildas were extraordinary women who shaped English history. They fought for what they believed was theirs in a time when women were rarely allowed such open displays of power. Two Matildas, one crown, and a whole lot of chaos. Number 4. Isabella of France vs. the Burgundy sisters, the adultery scandal that rocked a kingdom. This story is straight out of a medieval soap opera. We're talking about secrets, betrayal, and some very unhappy royal marriages in early 14th century France. At the center of it, in a way, is Isabella of France. She was the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair. Isabella herself was Queen of England, married to Edward II. Her marriage not great. But that's another story. Our main players in this scandal are Isabella's sisters-in-law. King Philip IV had 3 sons, and they were all married. Louis the heir was married to Margaret of Burgundy. Philip II's son was married to Jean II, Countess of Burgundy. Charles, the youngest son, was married to Blanche of Burgundy, John's sister. So, Margaret and Blanche were sisters, and Jean was their sister-in-law, and also a countess in her own right. Got it? Good. The drama kicks off around 1313 to 1314. Isabella and her husband, Edward II, were visiting the French court. Apparently, Isabella noticed something a bit off. The story goes that she gave her brothers and their wives beautifully embroidered purses as gifts. Later, during the same visit, she supposedly saw two knights carrying identical purses. Oh. Her spidey senses, or perhaps her own unhappy marriage experiences, started tingling. She suspected her sisters-in-law, Margaret and Blanche, were having affairs with these knights, Philip and Walter of Aunay. Now, what Isabella did next is debated by historians. Some say she told her father, King Philip IV, directly. Others think she might have confided in someone else, or that the king found out through his own network of spies. Regardless of how he learned about it, Philip the Fair was not a man you wanted to cross. He was known for his piety, but also for his ruthlessness. Remember, this is the king who took down the Knights Templar. An investigation was launched, and it was swift and brutal. The Aunay brothers, Philip and Walter, were arrested. Under torture, which was standard procedure back then, sadly, they confessed to having affairs with Margaret of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy. They apparently said these affairs had been going on for about 3 years. The consequences were horrific for the knights. They were found guilty of lèse-majesté, a crime against the king, because cuckolding a royal son was a massive insult, and more importantly, it cast doubt on the legitimacy of any children. Their execution was public and incredibly gruesome. We're talking castration, being broken on the wheel, flayed alive, and then hanged or beheaded. The chroniclers didn't skimp on the gory details. It was a clear message: do not mess with the royal family. And what about the princesses? Margaret of Burgundy, wife of the heir Louis, was found guilty. Her hair was shorn, and she was imprisoned in the infamous Chateau Gaillard, a grim fortress. The conditions were terrible. Blanche of Burgundy, wife of Charles, was also found guilty and sent to Chateau Gaillard with her sister-in-law. Jean II, Countess of Burgundy, wife of Philip, was also implicated. She was accused of knowing about the affairs and possibly even encouraging them, or perhaps having her own indiscretions. She was imprisoned at Dordogne. However, her situation was a bit different. She was a countess in her own right, with her own lands and power. Her husband Philip also stood by her. After about a year, she was cleared by the Paris Parliament, perhaps due to political pressure or lack of concrete evidence against her directly, and allowed to return to court. She and Philip even went on to have a seemingly successful marriage and rule. But for Margaret and Blanche, there was no such happy ending. Margaret of Burgundy died in Chateau Gaillard in 1315, after about 2 years of imprisonment. Some sources whisper that she might have been strangled or just died from the harsh conditions. Her husband, Louis, was now King Louis X, and he needed a legitimate heir. He quickly got his marriage to Margaret annulled, conveniently after her death. or perhaps pushed through while she was still alive and dying, and remarried. Blanche of Burgundy remained imprisoned in Chateau Gaillard for many years. Even after her husband Charles became King Charles IV, she stayed locked up. Eventually, her marriage was annulled in 1322, and she was allowed to take the veil, becoming a nun. This was a common way for disgraced noblewomen to disappear from public life. She died a few years later. This whole affair, known as the Tour de Nasle scandal, named after a tower where some of the illicit meetings supposedly happened, though that part is more legend than fact, was a massive shock to the French court and to Europe. It had serious dynastic consequences. Louis X died without a surviving adult son from his second marriage. This led to debates about whether a woman, his daughter Jeanne, could inherit the French throne, eventually leading to the Salic law, being firmly established in France, saying, "Nope, no women rulers," and Isabella, her role as the Quilode, if that's indeed what she was, is fascinating. Some portray her as a moral crusader. Others see her as possibly motivated by her own complicated feelings or political maneuvering. It's hard to say for sure. What is clear is that the scandal she allegedly unveiled had a devastating impact on the lives of Margaret and Blanche and sent ripples through the French royal line for generations. It was a harsh reminder of the dangers faced by royal women if they stepped outside the very strict boundaries set for them. Number 3. Isabeau of Bavaria, vis. Valentina Visconti, witchcraft, madness, and a fight for France. Welcome to the chaotic French court of the late 14th and early 15th centuries. King Charles VI, known as Charles the Well-Beloved in his youth, had a major problem. He started suffering from bouts of severe mental illness. We're talking episodes where he didn't recognize his own wife, thought he was made of glass, or ran howling through the palace. This, understandably, created a huge power vacuum. Enter our two leading ladies tangled up in the mess. First, there's Isabeau of Bavaria. She was Charles VI's queen. Married young, she was known for her lavish tastes, her love of parties, and her political involvement, which grew as her husband's condition worsened. Her reputation over the centuries has been pretty terrible, often painted as selfish, greedy, and even treasonous. Modern historians are a bit more nuanced, but she was definitely a controversial figure. Then there's Valentina Visconti. She was an Italian princess from Milan, the daughter of the powerful Duke of Milan. She married Louis, Duke of Orleans, who was King Charles VI's younger brother. Valentina was described as charming, intelligent, and cultured. She had a close, possibly even affectionate relationship with King Charles VI during his lucid moments. He seemed to find her presence soothing. The problem was, with the king frequently incapacitated, who was really in charge. A struggle for influence and power erupted, mainly between two factions. On one side was Louis, Duke of Orleans, Valentina's husband. He was ambitious and wanted to play a leading role in governing France. On the other side was Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and later his son, John the Fearless. The Burgundians were also super powerful and had their own ideas about how France should be run. Initially, Queen Isabeau and Louis of Orleans, and by extension, Valentina, were often allied. They seemed to work together to manage the government during the king's episodes. Valentina was well liked by the king, and this gave the Orleans faction an edge. Louis became very influential, which made his rivals, especially the Burgundians, very jealous and suspicious. But things started to sour. The French people, suffering from high taxes and the ongoing 100 Years' War with England, grew resentful of the lavish lifestyles of the nobility, including Isabeau and the Orleans. And Valentina, being a foreigner and close to the ailing king, became an easy target for nasty rumors. This is where the accusations of sorcery come in. Yes, witchcraft. People started whispering that Valentina Visconti was using dark arts to control the king, or perhaps to cause his madness, or to further her husband's political ambitions. Remember, she was Italian, and Italians were often stereotyped in France as being skilled in poisons and a bit too clever with magic. These rumors were fanned by those who wanted to discredit the Orleans faction. Some sources even claim that figures close to the Burgundian camp were actively spreading these stories. Imagine the fear and paranoia. The king is mad, and there's this Italian duchess who seems to have a strange hold over him. It was a perfect recipe for scandal. Valentina vehemently denied these accusations, of course. She even offered to undergo trials by ordeal to prove her innocence. But this was not taken up. The pressure became too much. In 1396, Valentina was forced to leave Paris. The official reason was to protect her from the angry populace, but it was effectively an exile from the center of power. This was a huge blow to her and to her husband, Louis. She retired to their ducal estates. Queen Isabeau's position in all this is complex. Did she believe the sorcery accusations? Or did she see Valentina as a rival for influence over her husband, or in the political sphere? Sources suggest Isabeau's relationship with Valentina deteriorated. Isabeau, needing to maintain her own power and navigate the treacherous waters of the French court, may have found it politically convenient to distance herself from the increasingly unpopular Valentina and Louis. Her allegiances shifted. Sometimes she sided with Orleans, sometimes with Burgundy. She was trying to keep herself and her children afloat. The rivalry between the Orleans and Burgundian factions reached a bloody climax in 1407. Louis, Duke of Orleans, Valentina's husband, was brutally assassinated in the streets of Paris. The order came from John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. This murder plunged France into a full-blown civil war between the Armagnacs, supporters of Orleans, and the Burgundians. Valentina Visconti was devastated by her husband's murder. She tried to get justice for him, appealing to the king and the court, carrying a banner with Louis's image, and demanding that John the Fearless be punished. But the Burgundian duke was too powerful. Valentina, heartbroken and politically isolated, died just a year later, in 1408. Her famous motto was, "Rien me plaît plus, ne mis rien." Nothing is more to me, more is nothing to me, reflecting her despair after Louis's death. Isabeau of Bavaria lived on for many more years, navigating the Civil War and the renewed English invasions. Her political decisions, particularly her role in the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited her own son, the Dauphin Charles, in favor of the English king, made her one of the most reviled queens in French history for a long time. The rivalry between Isabeau and Valentina, if it can be called that directly, was less about personal catfights, and more about the desperate struggle for influence and survival in a kingdom crippled by a mad king and torn apart by ambitious nobles. Valentina became a tragic victim of political machinations and xenophobic suspicions, while Isabeau played a longer, more controversial game, forever trying to secure her own position amidst the chaos. The accusations of witchcraft against Valentina show just how dangerous it could be for a noblewoman to be perceived as too powerful or too influential, especially if she was an outsider. Number 2. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the king's mistresses. Hell hath no fury like a queen scorned and imprisoned. Eleanor of Aquitaine. The name alone sounds legendary, and she was a Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, a massive, wealthy territory in France, Queen of France through her first marriage to King Louis VII, and then Queen of England through her second marriage to King Henry II. She was beautiful, intelligent, cultured, and incredibly powerful. Henry II of England was also a force of nature. Energetic, brilliant, a great warrior and ruler. Together, they should have been the ultimate power couple, ruling over a vast Anglo-French empire. And for a while, they were. They had many children, including future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. But Henry II had a problem. A big one. He was a serial philanderer. He had many, many mistresses. This wasn't exactly unusual for kings back then, but Henry seems to have been particularly blatant about it, and Eleanor, being who she was, a powerful duchess and a queen twice over, was not the type to just quietly accept public humiliation. While Henry had numerous affairs, one mistress became particularly famous, almost legendary. Rosamond Clifford. Fair Rosamond, they called her. She was reportedly very beautiful. The details of her life are a bit murky, as she wasn't a major political player, but more of a romantic figure. Henry seems to have been genuinely fond of her. He even built a house for her at Woodstock Palace and supposedly created a maze-like bower to keep her hidden and safe. Or maybe to keep her hidden from Eleanor. The rivalry here isn't so much Eleanor physically battling Rosamond in the halls of the palace. It's more about Eleanor's deep resentment of Henry's infidelities, with Rosamond becoming the most visible symbol of that betrayal. Imagine being Eleanor, one of the most powerful women in Europe, and your husband is openly parading his affairs. It wasn't just a personal sting, it was a political one too. A king's respected wife added to his prestige. A king with a famously unhappy wife, especially one as important as Eleanor, could look weak or poorly managed in his own house. Things came to a head in 1173. Eleanor had been growing increasingly discontented with Henry. It wasn't just the mistresses. Henry was also being stingy about giving their adult sons any real power or lands. So Eleanor did something shocking. She supported her sons, young Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, in a massive rebellion against their father, King Henry II. Some sources even suggest she was a key instigator. The rebellion was serious, shaking Henry's empire to its core. But Henry II was a formidable opponent. He eventually crushed the revolt. And he was furious with Eleanor. What did he do? He imprisoned her. Yes, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of England, spent the next 16 years as a prisoner of her own husband. 16 years. She was moved around various castles in England and France, kept under lock and key. It's during this period that the wilder legends about Eleanor and Rosamund Clifford emerged. The most famous one is that Eleanor found her way through Rosamund's secret maze, sometimes with a silken thread, and confronted her rival. In these tales, Eleanor offers Rosamund a choice: a dagger or a bowl of poison. Rosamund, naturally, chooses poison and dies. It's a fantastic story. Very dramatic, very vengeful queen. But historians are pretty sure it's just that. A story, a piece of folklore that grew up later to explain Rosamund's relatively early death and to dramatize Eleanor's anger. The facts are a bit more mundane, but still telling. Rosamund Clifford actually died around 1176, quite early in Eleanor's long imprisonment. She died of natural causes, it seems, and was buried at Godstow Abbey near Oxford. King Henry II was quite open about his affection for her, even after her death. He paid for a lavish tomb for her at Godstow, which became something of a local shrine. This, of course, further annoyed the church and probably didn't make Eleanor, even in her captivity, feel any better. Years later, a stern bishop, scandalized by the honoring of a royal mistress, had Rosamund's fancy tomb removed from the church and her remains reburied outside. Eleanor remained imprisoned until Henry II died in 1189. As soon as he was dead, her son, Richard the Lionheart, became king and immediately ordered her release. And Eleanor, then in her late 60s, burst back onto the political scene with incredible energy. She acted as regent in England while Richard was off on crusade, ruled Aquitaine, negotiated treaties, and arranged royal marriages. She was a dominant force well into her old age. So, was it a direct rivalry with Rosamund? Not in the sense of them constantly plotting against each other. Rosamund was more of a symptom of the deeper problem: Henry II's behavior and Eleanor's refusal to be a passive, humiliated wife. Eleanor's rival was in many ways her own husband's disrespect and the threat his affairs posed to her dignity and position. Her long imprisonment was a direct consequence of her fighting back against him. The legend of her confronting Rosamund shows how powerfully people felt about Eleanor's situation and her supposed desire for revenge on the woman who, in the popular imagination, represented her husband's betrayal. Number 1. Fredegund vs Brunhilde. The 60-year blood feud of the Frankish queens. If you want the ultimate medieval noblewoman rivalry, look no further than Fredegund and Brunhilde. This wasn't just a bit of courtly backstabbing. This was a decades-long brutal, blood-soaked feud that involved assassinations, wars, and the destruction of entire families. We're talking Game of Thrones level, but real. This all went down in Merovingian Gaul, what would later become France, in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Let's meet our contenders. Brunhilde, or Brunhaut, was a Visigothic princess from Spain. She was well-educated, beautiful, and very regal. Around 567, she married King Sigebert, the first of Austrasia, one of the Frankish kingdoms. Fredegund started from much humbler beginnings. She was initially a servant in the household of King Chilperic, the first of Neustria, Sigebert's half-brother. Fredegund was also beautiful, but she was known for her cunning, ambition, and utter ruthlessness. She became Chilperic's mistress. The spark that lit this 60-year fire: marriage and murder. King Chilperic, perhaps inspired or shamed by his brother Sigebert's fancy marriage to a princess, decided he wanted one too. So, he married Brunhilde's sister, Galswintha, another Visigothic princess. Galswintha came with a hefty dowry and importantly complained about Chilperic, still keeping Fredegund around bad move. Shortly after the marriage, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. And guess who Chilperic married very soon after Fredegund? Brunhilde was understandably enraged. Her sister had been murdered, and it looked very much like Fredegund and Chilperic were behind it. This kicked off a feda, a blood feud, between Brunhilde and Fredegund, and by extension between their husbands' kingdoms of Austrasia and Neustria. The fighting was relentless. Sigebert, Brunhilde's husband, was a successful warrior and was getting the upper hand against Chilperic. But then, in 575, as Sigebert was on the verge of total victory, he was assassinated. Stabbed by two young men wielding poisoned daggers known as Skarmasaxes, who sent them. All fingers pointed to Fredegund. She was known for using assassins like personal weapons. Now Brunhilde was a widow with a young son, Childebert II. Chilperic and Fredegund tried to seize her and her son's kingdom. Brunhilde was captured and briefly imprisoned, but she managed to escape and secure the throne for Childebert, ruling as his regent. She was determined to protect her son and avenge her husband and sister. Fredegund, meanwhile, was busy consolidating her own power in Neustria. She was absolutely lethal when it came to removing rivals or anyone she perceived as a threat to herself or her children with Chilperic. She had Chilperic's sons from his previous wives eliminated. One was murdered, another forced into a monastery. She even had a bishop who criticized her stabbed during Mass. No one was safe. Then, in 584, King Chilperic I, Fredegund's husband, was himself assassinated while returning from a hunt. Who did it? It's one of history's great wad units. Some suspected Brunhilde, seeking revenge. Some even suspected Fredegund, perhaps fearing Chilperic might set her aside. Or it could have been an unrelated noble with a grudge. We'll never know for sure. Fredegund was now a widow with an infant son, Clotaire II. Just like Brunhilde, she now had to fight to protect her child's inheritance and rule as regent. For years, these two queens, Brunhilde in Austrasia, and later Burgundy, another Frankish kingdom her son inherited, and Fredegund in Neustria, maneuvered, plotted, and sometimes directly waged war against each other through their sons and supporters. They were both incredibly strong women, dominating the political landscape. Fredegund was the master of the shadows. Poison, daggers, false accusations. She once sent assassins, disguised as clergy, to try and kill Brunhilde and her son. Another time, she supposedly tried to crush Brunhilde with a booby-trapped ceiling. Brunhilde was more of an open political player, a stateswoman trying to centralize royal power, reform administration, and build alliances. But she could be just as fierce and unforgiving when crossed. She faced constant opposition from powerful nobles who didn't like her strong rule or her foreign, Visigothic origins. Fredegund died relatively peacefully in her bed in 597. For someone who lived so violently, it was a surprisingly calm end. She had successfully protected her son Clotaire II and ensured he would inherit Neustria. You could say she won her personal battles, but the feud didn't die with Fredegund. It continued through her son, Clotaire II, and Brunhilde and her descendants. Brunhilde went on to rule as regent for her son Childebert II, then for her grandsons Theudebert II, King of Austrasia, and Theuderic II, King of Burgundy. She was a dominant figure for decades. She had grand plans for the Frankish kingdoms. However, she eventually fell out with her grandsons. Theudebert II even imprisoned her for a while. After Theudebert's death, possibly at the hands of his brother Theuderic, with Brunhilde's encouragement, Theuderic briefly reunited Austrasia and Burgundy. But then he died suddenly of dysentery. This left Brunhilde, now an old woman, perhaps in her late 70s or even 80s, trying to rule as regent for her young great-grandson, Sigebert II. But the Austrasian nobles had had enough of her. They betrayed her. They allied themselves with Fredegund's son, Clotaire II of Neustria. In 613, Clotaire II captured Brunhilde. What happened next was horrific, even by the brutal standards of the time. Clotaire II, son of Fredegund, finally had his mother's great rival in his hands. He accused Brunhilde of all sorts of crimes, including the deaths of 10 kings of the Franks, a wild exaggeration, but it showed the depth of hatred. She was tortured for 3 days. Then, according to the chronicles, the elderly queen was paraded through the army camp on a camel as an object of ridicule. Finally, she was tied by her hair, one arm, and one leg to the tail of an untamed horse. The horse was set loose, and Brunhilde was dragged and trampled to death. Her body was then burned. It was an absolutely brutal end to an epic life and an even more epic feud. Clotaire II went on to unite the Frankish kingdoms under his rule, finally ending the long wars. The rivalry between Fredegund and Brunhilde wasn't just personal. It shaped the political destiny of the Frankish world for over half a century. Two incredibly powerful, determined, and often terrifying women, locked in a struggle that outlived one of them and ended in unimaginable horror for the other. It's a stark reminder that medieval noblewomen could be just as ambitious, ruthless, and politically significant as any king.